For those of you who are in the U.S., happy Thanksgiving. And for those of you who aren't, it's another Thursday. Probably still Thursday everywhere. I'm Meg Riley here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where it started to snow, and this is a special Thanksgiving Day in the U.S. internationally focused day at the VUU. We'll start by having our regulars introduce themselves, and then we'll introduce our special guests.
Hey folks, Bob LaValle calling in from Buffalo, New York, where I have a lovely bread and leek and apple and bacon stuffing in the oven. So I might jump up in the middle of the program to take it out, just so you know.
Go based! Go based! And I'm Hank Purse, speaking to you from Medford, Massachusetts, home of grandmother's house of Over the River and Through the Woods fame. And happy to be with you while my Canadian wife is downstairs making some food that we will bring to my parents' house this afternoon, or my sister's house, I should say.
So are you saying the person who wrote that song is from Medford? Is that what you would?
Lydia Mariah Childs grew up at the First Parish Unitarian in Medford.
Well, how the mighty have fallen. No.
And the other, our other like musical claim to fame there. I was the minister there for 12 years. So, Fanny Farmer grew up in that church of cookbook fame, and also John Pierpoint was the minister there, and his son James wrote Jingle Bells.
Well, what a town it is. Well, we have three special guests from what is it, above the 49th parallel. We have three Canadians with us here today. They had always progressive, they had their Thanksgiving already weeks ago. They just finished it off quickly. So we've got Liz James, who's a seminarian and blogger from Saskatoon. We've got Stefan Jonasson, a UU minister and editor of, wait for it, Lugburg a Kim Kringla. Right, Stefan?
I'm sure that's exactly right.
Go ahead, Stefan. Say how it's really said.
It's Lugberg Hemskringla, just the way it's written.
Oh, Hemskringla is one word. It's divided on the line I'm looking at. Got it, Hemskringla. Having been to Iceland twice, that's what all the streets look like to me, just like that. And
I'm just curious about, are we allowed to say words like that in public?
Brian Kiely is the minister of the UU Church of Edmonton and the former president of the International Council of Unitarian Universalists, which is great because although we're going to talk about Canada, we're also going to talk about what's going on in Burundi, and Brian can fill us in on some of them.
So I have my Transylvanian coffee mug.
There you go.
And while I want to wish all my American friends happy Thanksgiving, I'm personally probably the only of the Canadians here today celebrating a different kind of Thanksgiving, because on Sunday, Canada celebrates its 103rd Grey Cup Football Festival, the championship of Canadian Football League, and my Edmonton Eskimos are in the game. So there you go.
Well,
there it goes.
Woo! 3 is a big year. That must have special anniversary.
Where's the Grey Cup being played?
Brian,
In Winnipeg.
my city's hosting, and so we had to lose early on so that we would have time to host you folks at the game.
And you did it very effectively.
Who are they playing? The Prince Edward Island Dorymen or something? Or?
No, they're playing the
one of
Ottawa
the
Red Blacks, who dress up like lumberjacks and wear plaid, if you can believe it.
Or one of the two teams named Rough Riders. So that's,
No, there's only one team named Rough Riders. It's now the Ottawa Red Blacks. But I have never seen a football uniform that actually incorporates red and black plaid before. It's pretty cool.
Plaid is in. There's a lot of that in Minnesota, where I'm from. So have you guys gotten rid of all the offensive racist native names that we can't seem to get over, or are they still lurking around Canada too?
We don't generally have them very much in professional sports, except our team is called the Eskimos and has been for 50 years. And no one's actually protested it much because, for one thing, we don't use any Inuit images. The team mascots are a polar bear and a football. So.
Yeah, polar bear isn't really so offensive. You don't have a little cartoon Eskimo.
Yeah. No, exactly. Never have.
Not a lot of Inuit people in the region where that sports team is. It's kind of an interesting choice for that reason.
Yeah, but.
Huh, interesting. Well, there's so much to talk about where to begin. So I wanted to begin with your prime minister, who is, of course, an international rock star, who I had thought that Obama was the best-looking head of state in the world, but I'm not sure now. I'm not sure. Two really good-looking families, and it looks to me like the sense of joy and relief there is quite similar to what some of us felt here, not only at Obama's arrival, but also at his predecessor's departure. Brian, how's that been for you?
It has been an amazing and exciting thing. By the way, President Obama gave one piece of advice to Justin Trudeau. He said, start coloring your hair now so you don't watch it go gray while you're in office. We have, under the previous government, we had a very restrictive, we had a prime minister who was very much controlled everything, and it felt like a very, very dark time. And this new government that has come in has brought a ray of sunshine. Their first order of business, probably their first year, is going to be spent largely undoing things that the previous government had done. But personally, living in Alberta, which is sort of Texas North, we also elected a Social Democrat government, an NDP government, in the spring, and we have a very progressive city council. So for the first time in my 60 years, I am living in a country, in a place, in a city where all three orders of government consider the social agenda as important as the economic agenda. And the relief that is flooding around the country is tremendously exciting. And I'm going to just jump to this one right away. The big example is that our new Prime Minister, during the campaign, pledged to bring 25,000 Syrian refugees to Canada. Now, by contrast, President Obama is trying very hard to bring 10,000 to the United States, which is 10 times bigger than we are. And Mr. Trudeau said, yes, we're going to follow through on this. And in our little Unitarian movement, we only have 42 or 43 congregations up here. 24 of us are involved in trying to settle refugee families where we live, including my congregation, and we're just about to file our application for a family.
It's amazing. How long are they thinking it'll take there?
Well, they expect to have the first 10,000 in by Christmas. They're going to house them on military bases, and they're going to bring in, this was just announced, because remember, the election was just a month ago. And so they're bringing in 10,000 people, most of whom have connections, like the family we're trying to bring in, where the sister of the father of the refugee family has lived in Edmonton for 30 years. So, this is tremendously exciting. We've been working with this family. It's great. Our whole congregation is involved. We have about 230 people in our congregation. We had an information session. 60 people came. The votes have been instant. The money came in. We had to raise $20,000. We're at $15,000, and we only approved the program 8 days ago. And everybody I've talked to said, well, I haven't got a lot of money, but I want to volunteer my time to help this family get settled. And I know this is being repeated in congregations across Canada and among citizens. I've had people from outside the church calling up and say, well, I heard you Unitarians do this, so I bet you got something going with the refugees. Do you? And I said, yeah, we do. I said, okay, can I contribute? Because we need to put our money somewhere. So, and I think that's symbolic of this sense of the scientists are now free to speak again. We have restored, believe it or not, the previous government canceled the census because they really didn't want to know anything they didn't believe. You know, my American friends are probably familiar with
a president who was not reality-based. We're familiar with this, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, so there is something that's sweeping the country. Yeah, there's something that's sweeping the country that's very exciting, and just as a small point, I'd like to mention that I don't believe I heard the name Jesus once during our entire 72-day election campaign.
Is there any sense that there's a backlash, or is it too soon?
From Americans?
No.
Well, let's
let somebody else answer that one.
Okay.
I want to just thank the Canadians for jumping forward. We have a CLF member who is in Turkey, a refugee from Syria, wonderful active member for years of CLF, puts pictures up of his daughter drawing flaming chalices, and one of the congregations in Canada has agreed to be his sponsor, and I just couldn't be happier. So thank you for that. I think U.S. congregations would step up if it felt like there was much of anywhere to step right now besides in piles of stuff. But Stefan, will you take a minute and just kind of, assuming that a lot of people are, listening to this while they make turkeys in the U.S., will you explain, because your government is very different than ours, and I think Americans often project our own system onto how it works. Will you just quickly walk through how it works, how you could have a 5-week election, how different it is?
Well, I mean, we have a fundamentally different way of doing democracy. We operate under a parliamentary system rather than a congressional system, and as a consequence, while we have a ceremonial head of state, we actually have two. The Queen, of course, Queen Elizabeth, is the nominal head of state of Canada. Be nice there. I know that Hank loves the Queen and would bow and even curtsy if necessary to meet her. And she gave me a medal, so I've become very fond of Her Majesty.
I see where this is going. All right, sure.
But so we have a ceremonial head of state. The role is actually exercised by our Governor General, who's the Queen's representative and the nominal head of state. And the Governor General gives speeches, cuts ribbons, and talks a lot about national unity, and is therefore, generally speaking, a unifying figure. And our government is led by the Prime Minister, who is the woman or man who can command a majority in the House of Commons, which would be comparable to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so we have a very different system for electing our primary leadership. And one of the things that happens is that there's then always a standing opposition in Parliament, except in Alberta during the social credit years. So in addition to having a prime minister, there are also members of opposition parties. We typically have 3 to 6 parties represented in our House of Commons, so we're a multi-party system. Because each of the parties has leaders, we're not going through, except at a local level, we're not going through long nomination processes for the 2 years leading up to our election. So we can do an election campaign typically in 5 weeks. And
the people who are elected actually run the country instead of campaigning all the time.
That's it exactly. There's always politicking going on. So, of course, the members of the opposition benches are always trying to score points, and the members of the government benches are always trying to put the best appearance on things. So there's always politicking, but there isn't constant campaigning. There isn't the kind of intense fundraising. I was briefly a candidate in this election, and my whole campaign probably cost $25,000. At least that's what we were budgeting for. Well, it's inconceivable to imagine running for the House of Representatives from North Dakota on a campaign that wasn't several dozens or hundreds of times larger. So we just have a very different system of governance. We have public financing of election campaigns. So in addition to
I'm whimpering right now.
Yeah, it's a very civilized system. And
it's inconceivable, isn't it? As my fellow Americans, do you agree that it's just so far away from how we're the horrible system that we're in?
Well, Hank, I was wondering, because you're married to a Canadian who's lived under both of these systems, I bet she's got some stuff to say.
The country is so small. Canada is just so tiny. We were watching the returns actually on that night, and Rebecca was like, "Oh, I know that guy. Oh, I went to college with that guy." Rebecca actually went to. She was like a year or two ahead of their new prime minister at McGill, and she's like, "Oh no, yeah, we see him all around. No, yeah, we see." So it's a small country, so they can have these quaint little dabbles into democracy. But I mean, of course, the difference between parliamentary systems and our system is the power of the party, which is much stronger in parliamentary systems than it is in our system. We're like the majority whip, like they actually have a whip, in Canada. They don't talk about it, but they really do. And no, and I mean, but it certainly is. Living with somebody under any other system, it would be like marrying somebody who followed a National League baseball team. They just have to keep explaining to them like why the DH is important. It's just one of these. It was one of these things that we're constantly doing, and of course there's pluses and minuses with all the different votes, and of course, and people, especially in national elections, people in both systems are always sort of saying like, 3 million people voted for the Green Party, but there's only one Green Party person elected in all of Canada, on the national stage, and so people are sort of saying like that's not representative of everyone who voted Green, and so it's there's always those sort of situations too, and of course in Great Britain, you had a lot of very right-wing parties that also only got one seat in British Parliament. But but a lot of people voted for these right-wing candidates. So do we say like that's wrong? We want more fascists in our government. So it's
yeah. Hey Liz,
I'll just jump in on that and say that one of the things the new government has promised is some form of proportional representation, and I don't want to get into the mechanics of it, but they're going to change the way there's people who vote, because they do recognize that a lot of people are feeling frustrated that this first past the post simply doesn't work for them. The other one tiny little comment I'd make, and this is a for better or worse, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but because the party rules the parliament, we don't have the kind of ridiculous legislative gridlock we've been chortling over for the last 4 years. When the government wants a bill to pass, it'll pass in most circumstances. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes not such a good thing. But stuff happens.
Yeah. Liz, I'm curious, in Saskatoon, what's it like? I probably know much less about Saskatoon than Edmonton and Winnipeg. For starters, I've never been there. So what's it like politically there?
Well, the conservative, it used to be that Brian's province was sort of the Texas of Canada. It was the conservative stronghold for decades and decades, and they've recently swung way a title open, and my province has jumped right in there and taken it. So I'm quite excited about the more leftist government in the whole country, but my province has not followed suit that way. So we're sort of in a mixed situation here.
So what would that mean? Here we have this whole states' rights movement. I mean, how do the provinces and the national government interact, and who can the national government trump the provincial government, or on what kinds of things? Here's my own ignorance about Canada.
I think it depends on the issue. You don't get quite as much of... The United States is very different culture from state to state sometimes, and there can be a big fight between the state and the national government, and it's not quite so much that way. So in Quebec, because it is very much its own distinct culture, but there is more of a sense of unity among the forms of government, is my sense.
Yeah, you're right. And it goes back to the founding documents, the British North America Act of 1867, that spelled out certain very broad separations of powers, that the federal government would have a couple of things, and the provincial government would have some resource control, control over education, healthcare. So the federal government mandates a national healthcare policy, for example, and each province then operates it in their own way. But there are more powers, more real powers in the hands of the federal government. And arguably, you could say the provinces have local powers, powers that
Brian,
affect the local citizens.
Something like the tar sands. What was And how's legislation around the tar sands going to change now, do you think?
Well, our premier has just introduced not legislation, but the first ever meaningful environmental climate change plan here in Alberta that actually is going after a much worse polluter, and that's closing down coal-fired power plants. The oil sands, which is what we prefer to call them in Alberta, what the current Premier Notley, is trying to do is dial down the rhetoric, because on both sides, the environmentalists and the oil companies have been so polarized that it really looks like the American Congress. They've been so polarized that there's been no room for conversation, and she's coming up the middle and bringing people together. Because much as I would love to see this change, the world's not going to stop needing oil very soon. And the oil companies need a certain amount of credit for the work they have done on reclaiming land and controlling emissions. It's still growing because the oil sands are being exploited more and more, but it's growing at a much slower rate.
But it's a good illustration of the difference of the powers of the different levels of government, where the process of extraction falls under provincial authority, and transportation by pipeline and rail falls under federal jurisdiction, so that ultimately the provinces and the federal government have to come to some sort of agreement to actually be able to extract a natural resource and then get it to market.
Right.
So is there a separation of church and state in Canada? I'm just going to change the subject. Let's go back talking about churches. So is there a separation of church and state there, or does the Queen really? How much do you get tax money from the Queen? Does she actually come to your church? And
she's a non-entity. We had debates when I first went to Meadville, so I'm meeting a lot of Americans, and we had debates for something like our bills until at one point I actually look at them. We don't have the Queen on all of our bills. The Queen is much less of an entity. How my dad explained it to me when I asked him why we have a Queen is he said that there are a lot of really important...
Oh darn! What a bad breakup.
I know. Yeah. What was that? What? I missed your dad's explanation. You broke up.
Back?
Yeah, you're
Yes.
back. Yeah.
Okay. And he said they have to, but people want to interact with celebrities, and so we have the people who run the country, and then we have the Queen to fulfill that need to cut ribbons and get medals, and in our case it's the Governor General. But it's very much like that. Like, we have a sense that the Prime Minister and the government runs the country, and the royalty or representatives of the royalty is very much a ceremonial function, I would say.
I think one clarification is Canadians have full freedom of religion and expression, and in that sense we have enormous religious freedom in this country compared to...
What about hockey? How does hockey work into it, though? Wait.
Well, hockey is a matter of faith. That transcends even religion. But we don't have strict separation of church and state. So, for instance, there was a Unitarian fresh air camp along the shores of Lake Winnipeg that was eligible to receive government funding for physical enhancements. We have public funding of certain religious schools in most provinces, and so there isn't the rigidity of the separation of church and state. We even have a thing called the Table of Protocol in all of our provinces. So here in Manitoba, the Roman Catholic bishops of Winnipeg and St. Boniface and the Anglican Archbishop of Rupert's Land at a public event nominally have a role ahead of the ragtag Unitarian Universalists who show up if matters of protocol come into play. So it means they get to march a little closer behind the Lieutenant Governor if there's a procession. But other than kind of little things like that, and of course funding for schools isn't exactly a little matter, but other than matters like that, I think we don't have precisely separation of church and state, but I think we have tremendous fairness in the equitable treatment of differing religious communities when it comes to their relationship with government.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's not quite as legally enforced, but it's much more strongly socially enforced. You don't hear as much religious talk in government by any stretch. My partner works in a hospital that is one of those funny. It is technically a Catholic hospital. It gets government funding, and they are very, very careful. Like they do have, for example, a morning prayer that goes out in the morning, but it was highly accessible to any religion, including atheists. So those spots where it does happen, they have to walk that line very, very carefully.
So they don't have every woman take a pregnancy test before she does anything.
No, nothing like that.
Hospitals do here.
There was a flap actually the last year or two. The previous prime minister basically sicked the CRA, that's like the IRS, on predominantly liberal charities, challenging their tax status, because a charity is allowed to devote 10% of the resources, human and economic, towards political activity, but no more. And so the Canadian Unitarian Council was actually audited for this. And we still haven't heard the results of the audit, but the new prime minister has said, yeah, we're throwing that out. And that's the closest I've ever seen to the state trying to interfere with religion or justice work.
When they say political there, do they mean issue-based or candidate party-based?
Issue-based.
So even issue-based, you can only do 10%.
Yeah, because, correct me, but Stefan, you'll know for sure, but because there's government funding for election campaigns, mostly the law requires individuals to support political parties, not organizations.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, organizational funding is prohibited in terms of directly to the political process. So unions can't make union donations. Corporations can't make corporate donations in the electoral process.
Wait a minute. Aren't corporations people up there?
Well, the legal fiction of corporate personhood exists, but we don't extend civil rights to corporations.
That's refreshing. That's different.
Yeah. Now, that said, of course, people get around it by, some CEO will give everybody in their company $250 to go support the party of his choice. But for the most part, those are really minor kinds of. I mean, when they try and prove election fraud in Canada, it's kind of like parking ticket violations. I mean, it's total misdemeanor nonsense.
So do you have the equivalent of the angry white man that we have down here who are really loving Trump and really just fed up with the whole thing? I mean, because
we just voted him out of office.
Well, I mean, but he's like normal compared to some of what we got going on. I mean, do you have just the people who are just gone rogue, like with rage?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We have Ezra Levant. Ezra Levant has been fired from numerous newspapers and TV networks because he is so right-wing, and now he's working in the YouTube universe at rebel.ca, and he has that wonderful disregard of facts, never let fact get in the way of a good opinion and things like this. But he's our best example of an angry white guy.
A few years ago, we had someone called Bill Whatcott who was saying negative things about gay people and stuff like that, quite toned down by American standards, but that was our equivalent. And it went to the Supreme Court. The Unitarians in several cities was actually an intervener in the case, and they wound up passing for the whole country, the law being, the interpretation being that we're allowed to say, express any opinion, but not in a hateful way that vilifies people. So the idea being the goal is an open discourse, and so if you're saying things that makes it hard.
We're hoping the internet gets to Saskatchewan soon.
Well, but this
pull the string on the can tighter. Pull the string on the can tighter.
But the principle of looking at it being that the idea is to have a good dialogue rather than an individual's right to say whatever they want, which, of course, I mean, that happens differently in daily life, but there is a moral sense of the community discussion is a valuable part of the dialogue rather than an individual's right to say whatever the heck they want. And again, that's often forced socially as much as by laws, but the laws are different.
We have less tolerance for emoting hate as a form of public discourse. And we control it mostly socially. I mean, we do have hate speech laws, so that and I have to say, some of your presidential contenders have probably violated our hate speech laws.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
But we just have a different sensibility. Yes, we have the equivalent of the angry white man. I think the difference is that our political structures are actually less likely to empower them to be able to get away with being that uncreative. But that said, as I learned during the election campaign, there is in fact a fringe of individuals in our country who are as committed to spreading malicious gossip and misrepresentations as there are in the U.S. It's just that it's a fairly tiny phenomenon here.
And then there's Rob Ford. And then there's Rob Ford. And,
that's right.
He was furthering the community.
We were, in an odd way, kind of proud of Rod Ford because we got to have a genuine international political scandal. That was kind of fun.
Well, and of course, I think the proportion of Canadians who were embarrassed by him is actually larger than the proportion of Americans who are embarrassed by some presidential contenders.
Oh, no question about that. I mean, we've got, it's not, Trump and his brother with a YouTube station down here. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, Liz, what you were saying about a law that favors actual discourse over individual freedom, that's kind of amazing.
It specifically doesn't ban any. It bans a way of doing it that silences other people. It's also, there's an interesting social component to it where when you see people engaging in hateful things, Canadians tend to socially, will look down, will look away. It's like we're ashamed of what's going on. And it was interesting, I saw a comedian talking about after Rob Ford, right? And there was a ruling of the city council that said, we'd ask you to please, if you wouldn't mind, take a break. Most of them voted, and they were making fun of how tentative it was. And so a comedian went down to Toronto and was doing ridiculous things to see what the Canadians would do. And watching the video, he's like, and they do nothing. You're allowed to just, and they had someone, a Starbucks employee, yelling or doing all these Rob Ford-like behaviors. And watching it so it was this funny bit. Watching it as a Canadian, I thought, no, they're not okay with what you're doing. I could see them socially sanctioning you and telling you this is wildly inappropriate, but they were doing things like this, right? They were looking the other.
Yeah, it's social exclusion and isolation is often the first means of support.
Watch the Canadians' eyebrows.
So I'm really curious, Liz. I'm really curious to hear how it was encountering an American UU seminary. Liz is at Meadville as a Canadian, and actually for everybody who I don't know where y'all went to seminary, but I just wonder if it was you have a sense of being different, or if it doesn't matter at all, or.
A huge sense of being different.
And your interaction, all of you have been in congregations, so that too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was a huge cross-cultural experience. I also see it a lot in ministers coming from the States to work in Canada. And that thing about our way of saying no is to look down and not say anything. When you're a minister in a board meeting and you say, I have this great idea, and people look down and don't say anything, that means no way in hell, don't do that. No, terrible, terrible idea. Culture where if people think it's not a good idea, they'll say, no, that's not a good idea, which isn't, it's not to say that no Canadian will do that, but there is a significant difference. And so I perceived quite a difference in Meadville, particularly we were talking about issues of race the year that I came.
She always freezes.
You're freezing.
Okay. That's all right. Move on to the next person.
That's our censor.
Yeah, so I often tell American colleagues coming to Canada to be aware that silence is not consent in your congregation when you throw in your big ideas. People won't necessarily get in your face. They'll go, oh, really? And that means, yeah, probably better not go that way. But I went to Meadville too back during the Civil War, and back when Canada was still part of the UUA, and I know pretty much every day I had to sit in the back of the room and correct a professor and go, continental, not national, continental, not national. And it was, the other thing I found interesting was reading newspapers, and in 3 years at Meadville, the only time I saw Canada mentioned in the Chicago Tribune once was when a parking garage at a shopping mall collapsed and killed 20 people.
I had the experience of training entirely in Canada, so my cultural conflict tended to be theological within a Canadian context rather than cultural in a secular context. However, I worked for the UUA for 24 years, which actually for me worked relatively well during the continental phase, when, although there were often insensitivities, there was greater consciousness. It seemed strange, though, for the 12 or 13 years that I was at the UUA after the Canadian Unitarian Council took over, exclusive responsibility for the Canadian context, save for ministry, youth, and young adults. It felt strange to be the representative of the national office when I would show up to work with a congregation, and I was, of course, having to argue with Homeland Security to be able to show up in the first place to do it. My challenges actually were usually at the United States Customs and Immigration counter at the Winnipeg airport.
And you don't have to do that anymore. Yay!
You know what? Oh, I gotta tell you, this is a great thing. Stefan, back me up if you can. Liz too. I noticed something about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, flying to the States. Now, before that, you go through airport security, you go to the American immigration officer, and it looked like they were trained to not smile and not crack a joke ever. And about a year ago, I went through customs, and the immigration officer was going, where are you going? I'm going, well, I'm going to a church conference. All right, what you going to do? You going to drink a lot? And I went, holy mackerel, what's going on here? There's been a revolution in American immigration. They're nice. They're human.
It comes in waves.
An anomaly, Brian. Like, don't take that one to the bank.
No, it's been happening a lot.
I've had the exact same experience, same timeline, everything. Yep.
It comes in waves. I mean, I had the experience once of a Homeland Security officer asking me what made me so special that an American couldn't do my job, missing the irony that he was an American government official working in Winnipeg. And when I responded,
they're not long on irony. I find in the immigration services, the irony is not their strong suit.
When I responded by saying, what makes you so special, a Canadian couldn't do yours, I learned the word secondary inspection, which was not pleasant. But I also had, in earlier eras, I had one, it was then Customs and Immigration rather than Homeland Security. An officer threatened to handcuff me and make me smile. Which was actually offered in a friendly context, if you can imagine. But I've also had situations where they were kind of much more focused and nuanced about what they said, and I was about to have an unpleasant experience. And I'm guessing that post Paris, we will go back to the same old in terms of how friendly and humorous Homeland Security officers are at the airport.
So I want to ask you one more thing about Canada, and then I want to move on and talk about Burundi, which a number of people have information here about. So when you talk about this cultural context and the cultural norms that really hold things together, it sounds a lot like Minnesotans' cultural norms, actually. But where it breaks down here, and I wonder about in Canada, if you look at Minneapolis, say, gets all these awards of the most livable city, blah, 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 it also gets the third worst city for an African American to live in the country. And those cultural norms hold if you're part of that culture, which is a white, very white culture. And I wonder, because you've had a lot of immigrants come in, you've welcomed immigrants, although with having tried to be one with a lot of guidelines. But I just wonder how it is for people who aren't of that kind of quiet, look down, that's for here, that's a Germanic, Norwegian, Scandinavian kind of influence in Minnesota. So I just wonder how that works across culture. And I know you've focused a lot on multiculturalism in Canada, because I run into your stuff every time I go online from various governments work on multiculturalism. And I'm just curious about that.
Well, as it happens, Meg, my wife is of Japanese ancestry. And as it happens, her grandfathers or grandparents all arrived in Canada before my grandfather did. But she's still more likely to get the question, where are you from? And the answer isn't St. James. The answer is what country you come from, or to have people say, compliment her on how well she speaks English. And of course, it just happens to be her mother tongue, so it comes naturally to her. So there are subtle things like that where there can still be, a sense of we still have a predominantly European sense of identity in many places. By the same token, we have a new Minister of National Defense who wears a turban, and that's been standard practice. Our Mounties, our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, are noted for their funny hats of English origin, but we've had a policy in place now for many years that allows people of different cultures who've come to Canada, who serve in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to wear alternative headgear. So I suppose that the challenges are more subtle in a Canadian context, and perhaps that actually requires us to pay just a little more attention to the quiet ways in which we may be, exclusive or too quick to homogenize our understanding of the country. So we have to be a lot more attentive to the subtle signals rather than some of the more glaring ones.
With a couple of urban exceptions too, the biggest racial ethnic issue in Canada is the way we treated our native population.
Yeah.
We've gone through a 3-year Truth and Reconciliation process that ended last year, and now it's going through so what are we going to do about it now that we got this wonderful report? And I know I was greatly uplifted when the city of Edmonton introduced an End Poverty Edmonton campaign, and one of the 5 game-changing pieces was honoring our treaty culture, recognizing that we are all treaty citizens. That's how we were settled. We still have treaties governing large areas of land, and that we're all treaty citizens no matter what our race or background. We are all governed by the treaties, and we all have obligations and responsibility to those treaties. And that feels like a big step forward.
I serve on the board. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
Sorry. I think what's happening around that is really incredibly exciting. When I first went to Meadville, I alluded to noticing differences between the race relations, and the truth is that I looked at it and was like, and felt, no, but we don't have that in Canada. We're so much farther ahead in Canada. It's so much better in Canada. And over time in Canada. And when you look at the actual statistics about difference in incarceration rates and infant mortality and those kinds of things, it's worse in Canada, but and so it demands a whole different set of tools. which has been an interesting process for me to realize. Go ahead, Stefan. Sorry I interrupted you.
We just learned that Indigenous persons in Canada are 10 times more likely to be the victims of murder, and so we have some serious challenges. At the same time, I serve on the Board of Regents of the University of Winnipeg, and we just approved a new strategic directions statement that includes 5 pillars on which our university is based. One of them, what we call indigenization, which is our recognition that our university stands on treaty land, that the treaties with the First Nations people are treaties to which we are all party. They are agreements, and they provide rights and obligations across the board. And so we're striving as a university to ensure that we honor those commitments, that we represent represent the historic fact that our university exists on what were once First Nations lands, and that we incorporate that in our way of being an academic institution. So we just approved a policy, for instance, that there is now an Indigenous course requirement, and no student can graduate from our university without taking a minimum amount of coursework about Indigenous history, culture, language, and the social issues that face us.
And that
They
is
do that at my 12.
That's much bigger than it seems. That's
Yes.
actually a huge step.
Well, let's change the subject completely. Thanks. That was a great. It's really interesting to hear a lot about Canada. But Brian, why don't you, as the former president of the International Council of Unitarian Universalists, which has been very active on what the situation in Burundi is, if you would just start by briefing everybody about what happened and a little bit of a timeline, and then we can have a conversation about what's happening and what needs to happen.
Okay. Well, the headline is that the minister and fellow executive member of the ICUU, Fulgence Ndjimana, was arrested and has been detained by police for the last week or so. But the backup on that, what's happening in Burundi, we're all so caught up in ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whoever you want to call them today. That's not what's going on here. This is much more like Rwanda 20 years ago, where there is intertribal tensions that's breaking out. The president, who is limited to 2 terms, wants to run for a 3rd term, and is using the police and the military forces to crack down on democracy. And the Unitarian Church it's a French-speaking country. The Catholic Church is dominant. The Unitarian Church is a small little blip, but it exists. And Fulgence has not only been ministering that church and setting up the 2nd church, Unitarian Church building in all of Black Africa, but he's also been doing fundraising in North America so they can do microloans that have been very successful, and is running an AIDS care network for children. So he's not politically active, but he's an active guy, and he was arrested. And so the latest news we have is that he has 3 lawyers working for him.
Pause before you go.
Sure.
It seemed like it was not just about him getting arrested, but about the church.
It was. Forces broke into the church. There were some bullets fired. No one was hurt. Some people, after some previous unrest, actually are living in the church, but no one was hurt. But the church had a lot of things stolen from it and that sort of thing. It was wrecked on the inside. So those are the kinds of thing that's going on, and it's really not clear because Fulgence has to be careful in what he broadcasts to us, what the exact issues are. So we know Fulgence. Fulgence is actually one of the true leaders of the International Council in Africa. He's worked mentoring other congregations in Kenya and Uganda, and he really is a significant figure for us. I mean, we'd be helping him out if he wasn't, but he's a significant figure for us. And But the nice thing is a lot's gone out on social media and Facebook, and there have been a lot of responses from Europe and Canada and the United States. And we did just learn, we got a sort of perplexing kind of reply from the Burundian embassy in Washington that at least shows that they know they're being watched. So the folks at the ICUU feel he's fairly safe, and that he's probably, he's not being tortured. He's been rigorously questioned, but not tortured. They posted a picture a day or two ago, and he certainly looks fine. And we think he's going to be released. Beyond that, it's really tricky to say what happens next, but we are raising funds to support the congregation and to support Fulgence in his legal battles, and to support what's going forward in the Burundian congregation, because these folks are desperately poor. So I know we're posting the link on this chat, and anybody who wants to support, that would be great. But Liz, you've been spending a lot of time working with Fulgence too.
I dropped out briefly, and I missed what you've said already, so I'm a little worried that I would repeat myself. So.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
I'll chime in and interrupt you. I'm good at that.
Yes, I'm used to that. That's good.
The links are posted on this YouTube page, and also you can go to the Church of the Larger Fellowship Facebook page, main Facebook page, and find the link there as well.
Yeah. It is an interesting time in that country that most of us know very, very little about, but Canadians particularly, because one of our generals led the United Nations peacekeeping forces, have a real sensitivity around the genocide that happened in Rwanda, and there's an awful lot of fear that that could potentially happen here as well. So any influence to try and get various governments to pay attention to this one so that that doesn't happen is just a huge, huge step, because it's not just Fulgence, it's hundreds of thousands of lives that are at stake here.
Right, and I would say too, I recently wrote to the Burundi consulate here in the U.S., and you get a very strange letter back, and as soon as I get the strange letter back from them with a very strange story, I called up Eric Cherry at the UUA, who's in charge of our international office, and they said, like, pay no attention to the letter, but it's good that you have contacted them, just so they see the numbers of folks, and of course also giving on the giving to help support the legal side of this too is also really, really important, and also reminding folks that our Western money goes far too in helping pay folks pay for things outside of the U.S. and Canada.
Hey, can you point the way to find the address for the Burundi?
Yeah, I'll find it. I'll find it, and I'll post it, and then I'll let you post it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we have links. Lori did a whole thing with all the ways you could take action and everything. So
the nice thing about the letter, weird as it is it does demonstrate that they care about our good opinion. So that they've written a letter saying this is what happens means that it is effective that we're writing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do. And yeah, I first met Fulgence when he came to Canada in, I think, 2006, when he was reasonably out of Catholic seminary and was exploring Unitarianism, which he found on the internet, which is a fairly familiar story in Africa. And it's been interesting in the last 10 years to watch him emerge and be ordained and become really a strong force, a strong voice for liberty.
I've only met him at the ICUU meeting in New York last year, but I had a few meals with him, and he's just an amazing presence. I can imagine that his congregation would be very vital, because he is a very vital person.
Yeah, he has some really good people supporting him too, and we want to help them out as well. How big
is the congregation?
I'm hopeless on that. And you know what? In Africa, that's not a fair question.
Not really a fair question.
One of my stories in Kenya was, I said, well, how many people do you have in your church? And they said,
when?
We help 300 people. We help 300 AIDS orphans, and we help. They very much don't count on how many people you have, but what do you do?
That is wonderful, and I love it. And I just don't have a sense we're talking about a really small gang, or they're really, doing large.
Whenever I've seen pictures of worship, I've seen somewhere between 20 and 40 people in their hall. But I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means.
That is fair anywhere, I think. So.
I mean, he got himself arrested, so clearly there's something, happening in the Burundian church.
Well, and in terms of that whole sense of congregations and beyond and thinking about churches differently, when we ask what...
Good point.
Yeah, and when we think of churches and beyond, what does it mean? What do worship numbers mean? It's really what you do in the world. That's what you were saying, wasn't it, Liz?
Yeah.
Yes, only much better put. Thank you.
Stefan, at one point, was writing a book to that effect. I don't know what happened to that book, Stefan. Is it still coming?
The publisher was less enthusiastic than Tandy and I were.
Oh, well, that's too bad. Well, we just have a couple more minutes, so let's go around and have everybody say whatever they want to say that you didn't get to say about anything. Canada, turkeys, whatever it is. Brian, let's start with you.
I've talked a lot. I don't think I have anything that's left unsaid except, go Esks go on Sunday.
I believe you said that. Thank you.
Yeah. Having a Grey Cup party at my house. You're all invited.
Oh, we're all coming, man. I'm on my way.
We're having a Grey Cup party at my university. I mean, the whole grounds of the university has been taken over by tents to welcome Grey Cup folks. I think it's important to observe that it is November 26th, which means that it is the birthday of Octavius Brooks Frothingham.
Oh, nice.
The great leader of the Free Religious Association, which is what the UUA is really a continuation of. We like to think that we're the successors to the Unitarians and the Universalists, but we have much more in common with the Free Religious Association. Uncle Octave was born on this day in 1822, and he spends eternity within spitting distance of William Ellery Channing over at Mount Auburn, and I revere them both.
All right, thank you. Hank, what do you got?
Have a great Thanksgiving to our American followers, and keep fighting the good fight. There's lots of great protests and scary things that are happening across our country, but people doing good stuff, and keep fighting the good fight.
Liz, can you speak?
Nothing of interest, just happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for organizing this. This has been really fun.
It's been fun. Bob, how about you?
I just want to point out that my mother's maiden name is the same as Trudeau's wife, Sophie Gregoire. So in the spirit of a small country, maybe I'm related to Sophie Gregoire. I should invite myself to dinner.
That's great.
Great. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
I'll just say that in the course of this hour, we've got about an inch of snow. My yard finally looks like late November. Yesterday, my next-door neighbor was mowing his lawn. I was like, A, you are really compulsive, and B, it is November 25th, and you're mowing your Minnesota lawn. But he won't be mowing it anymore. He'll be shoveling it. I'm just going to get a couple inches today, but it's very cozy. It's very sweet, and my in-home warrior activist is here alive, and so I am a very happy mother right now. It's been a hard week, and I'm very happy that I'm going to go have breakfast before Blacksgiving over in the north at the 4th Precinct here, which will be joyful and life. Next week, we're having What's New in Religious Education with some religious education.
Drones.
Virtual reality.
And meanwhile, thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend, great holiday if it is a holiday for you. And you Canadians, get back to work.
Happy Thursday.
Be well all.
Bye.